Sonic the Hedgehog might be the fastest thing alive, but if there's one thing he can't outrun, it's the law. Now, the Sonic franchise has gone through several highs and lows throughout time, but unless you've actively been keeping up with them, you might not realize that the Sonic comics are a massive deal in the comic book industry, and they have been wrapped up in one of its biggest series of legal battles. These books are infamous for how straight up bonkers they are. From Tails fusing with his many multiversal variants to become a massive titan of nearly endless power, to Knuckles having been revealed to have been a genetically modified superweapon because his dad experimented on him as a kid, to one character straight up dying from eating a chili dog that was laced with LSD. See, although it started with silly slapstick humor, the Sonic comics evolved into an insane furry political soap opera with minimal oversight from Sega, which they would come to regret considering that things got so unbelievably absurd both in the comics and behind the scenes that Sega had to come in and completely destroy the comic book universe twice. And at the center of it all is one man, the single most hated person in the entire Sonic fandom, the mad god of Sonic himself, Kenneth W. Penders II. By weaving his way through the law, Ken Penders managed to walk away with over 200 characters, and is now using them to create this. And how it ended up happening is truly bizarre. So for my 400,000 subscriber special, I have combed through pages and pages worth of legal documents, publications, and blogs to capture all of the twists and turns of this massive debacle. Strap in, folks, because this one's a doozy. Hello and welcome to Comic Drake, where I talk about comic books and my name is Drake. Let's talk about it. Okay, it's the middle of summer in Texas. I cannot keep wearing this. It's too damn hot. But before jumping into things, I need to give a big thank you to the sponsor of today's video, Skillshare. Skillshare is an online community with thousands of inspiring and creative classes. As a tabletop game designer, Skillshare has been a great asset, such as Ben Panther's class on game design foundations. And also, I took Roxanne Gay's class on creative writing to help bring my video scripts to the next level, and I think people have noticed. There's classes for pretty much any skill you can think of, and at multiple levels. So whether you're starting a new hobby or looking to improve your existing skills, then Skillshare is the place for you. The first 1,000 of my viewers to sign up through my link will get a month of Skillshare absolutely free. So you can start exploring your creativity today. The comic book adaptation of Sonic the Hedgehog was released in 1992 and was loosely based on the cartoon by Deke Entertainment. This show, lovingly referred to as Sonic's Sat AM by its fans because of its Saturday morning time slot, is rather different from the small handful of video games that were released at the time. In this continuity, Dr. Robotnik had already succeeded in taking over the world before the events of the show, and it was Sonic's mission to take him down with the help of the Freedom Fighters, a group of animal commandos that were created specifically for this cartoon. Although Sat AM was certainly darker than Sonic media up until that point, it was still very lighthearted, and the comic that followed, produced over at Archie Comics, was much more the same, if not more childish. The early issues were extremely silly and downright nonsensical at times, like when Sonic got flung into an alternate dimension where he met a couple of physics-defying imps named Vertical and Horizontal. Remember them because they're actually going to come up later. But when the comics editor heard that one of the writers might be stepping down, he started looking for anyone to take over. The editor approached a man named Mike Contarovich for the job, but Mike had never even heard of Sonic before, prompting him to hit up his close friend and colleague, KenPenders, who had a son that was an avid video game fan. Although Penders was by no means a big-name creator at the time, he had worked for plenty of big comic publishers, including Marvel, DC, and even Disney, which, by the way, used to be a huge deal way back in the day. For context, Donald Duck is, to this day, the single most published comic book character outside of the superhero genre. Penders and Contarovich got the job and were basically allowed to do whatever they wanted, with neither Sega or Archie Comics giving them any guidelines on what kind of stories they wanted, or even what the characters they were writing were supposed to be like.
We would just pitch story after story, and we had no feedback whatsoever. They didn't tell us what stories to write. They didn't tell us what the characters should be like. The only thing they said was Sonic is cool and hip. That's it. That's the only direction we were given. You know, he has attitude.
Despite the lack of direction, Ken and Mike's Sonic comic was a rousing success, but it quickly turned into a solo project for Ken as Mike decided to journey out to greener pastures. As time went on, the tone of the series shifted from slapstick humor to something quite a bit more serious, like this whole sequence about how Sonic now understands the true meaning of war. Oh, and remember Horizontal and Vertical? Well, Ken turned them into robotic demigods that went to war with each other because each of them believes the other is responsible for the near destruction of their dimension. Look, these comics were weird. Penders was absolutely obsessed with his creations, heavily focusing on their romantic lives and constantly introducing long-lost relatives, especially with Knuckles' family. Like, this dude even put out an extensive family tree painstakingly laying out his lineage, which also reveals that his girlfriend is a distant cousin. Like, I get that it's so far back that the familial relation doesn't really matter, but they don't have to be related. You don't have to write that. But hey, I mean, keep the bloodline pure, I guess. The Knuckles stuff used to just be tacked onto the back of the Sonic comics, but eventually he got his own book, allowing for the Knuckles lore to wildly spin out of control, more or less interrupted by the main Sonic series. Additionally, because of that, the Knuckles comics were almost entirely about Ken's own original characters, so he wasn't beholden to most of the few guidelines that Sega demanded. So Penders could basically do any storyline that he wanted. But out of all of his creations, it's Lara Sue, the future daughter of Knuckles, that Penders has the greatest fascination with, and it'll inform a lot about his future, ultimately leading to... Regardless, the Sonic comics were a massive success, thanks to the character's popularity in other mediums, a highly devoted fan base, and actually selling the comics in places like grocery stores instead of dedicated out-of-the-way shops. It's almost as if selling stuff where people are actually going results in people buying it. Who'd have thought? Due to his clout within the Sonic franchise, Penders was invited to work on other official stuff like the cover art for the DVD box set of Sad AM. But Ken decided that he wanted to be even more involved, leading to his magnum opus, Sonic Armageddon. In 2002, Ben Hurst, one of the writers for Sad AM, pitched a continuation of the classic show as either a new season or as a movie. When word got to Penders that Hurst was trying to get the ball rolling, he wanted in. Although Ben brought Ken on board, Penders stabbed his new collaborator in the back and went directly to Sega, essentially telling them, "Hurst is trying to take the Hedgehog for his own. End him, and give the rodent to me. I'll bring you something beautiful." For some reason, Sega actually listened to Ken, and he went off to work on this pitch.
Uncle Chuck! Uncle Chuck! Whoa! This is way past cool!
Oh my god, I really wish I could show you more of this, but because of how trigger-happy Penders gets with lawsuits, which trust me, we will be getting into later in the video, I honestly think that he would try to take me to court over this. I mean, hell, I'd be extremely surprised if he didn't try to take down this entire video, regardless. But still, I need you guys to remember something extremely important here. Ken legitimately went to Sega and sat them down to watch this pitch.
Whoa!
Now, the concept art that Penders drew up for the project was significantly better than the video, but Sega obviously declined the pitch, though they didn't seem too turned off by the dude since Ken was still allowed to work on the Sonic comics with, again, minimal oversight. This allowed Penders and his cohorts to continue to do whatever they wanted, like make a group of Nazi echidnas that straight up do the Sieg Heil. And also, they took one of the most famous poems about the Holocaust, but changed up the words to make it about foxes and hedgehogs. Big yikes. All Sega ever really asked of Ken and his collaborators was to occasionally incorporate the recent game releases into the comic's plot, but they also refused to send him any of the games in question, or even resources for him to know what the games were even about. This came to a boiling point in 2006, when Penders was asked to incorporate the Shadow the Hedgehog game into the comic, causing him to leave in order to pursue work where he had a bit more creative control, specifically in Hollywood. Yeah, Ken, good luck with that.
Whoa!
One of these projects was a political drama called The Republic, and all that ever got produced was a pilot episode, and it's not good.
Oh man, I'm late. I gotta go. Man, I'm late. I gotta go. Oh, hey Betty, wait, careful, I got coffee. Bye-bye.
Penders also launched an indie comic in the year 2000 called The Lost Ones, which is about Japanese superhumans that were mutated descendants of those who survived the nuclear bombs dropped in World War II. The comic was canceled after just one issue, but Ken was so convinced that this was a, quote, best-selling comic that he wanted to turn it into the next great superhero film. Here's a clip from the trailer because it was very much not that. To this day, Penders is still trying to get every single one of these projects off the ground. And you know what? More power to him. In any other circumstance, this would be where the story ends. This video would just be some lighthearted laughs about an eccentric creator and the weird stuff that he and his collaborators produced. But like I foreshadowed at the top of the video, what follows is one of the most insane legal battles in all of comic history. Penders is a complete underdog, and throughout this next segment, it's going to seem like he doesn't have a leg to stand on. The man makes a complete buffoon of himself at every turn, and yet despite it all, he ended up winning the suits, and essentially walked away with the rights to an entire comic book universe. In 2008, BioWare released an RPG for the Nintendo DS called Sonic Chronicles: The Dark Brotherhood. Although the game was just okay, Sonic Chronicles was a love letter to all things Sonic, which of course included the comics. The antagonists of the game are the titular Dark Brotherhood, aka the Nocturnus Clan, a group of ancient echidnas that were sealed away within a dimension called the Twilight Cage by Knuckles' ancestors. There is zero doubt that these guys were inspired by the Dark Legion from the Archie comics. You know, a group of ancient echidnas that were sealed away within a dimension called the Twilight Zone by Knuckles' ancestors. But where things got real messy is that Sonic Chronicles prominently featured a character named Shade, an ass-kicking female echidna that defected from the Nocturnus clan. Just like Julie Sue, Ken's writer's pet, who is an ass-kicking female echidna that defected from the Dark Legion. Now, this shouldn't be an issue. After all, Penders is working with Archie Comics as a work-for-hire freelancer, and everything he wrote for them is the legal property of Sega. He even said as much himself in an interview with Sonic HQ News in 1999, stating, quote,
"Part of the contract Sega has with Archie stipulates any and all characters created in the Sonic & Knuckles comic books become property of Sega. Thus, Sega now owns everything I created in the Knuckles series, including Locke, Lara Lee, and Julie Sue, to say nothing of characters like Jeffrey St. John, Hershey, Dr. Quack, and Robbo the Hedge, to name but a few."
In spite of all of that, Penders still thought that he deserved a cut of the game's profits, and demanded that Archie's editor-in-chief, Victor Gorelek, give him a copy of his original contract, to which Gorelek replied, "There isn't one." This prompted Ken to go ahead and file copyrights for everything that he had ever done for the company, including his original characters. And listen, for as much as I have been and will continue to shit on Penders during this video, I actually have to side with him here. These stories and characters were oftentimes weird and unnecessary, but they were his weird and unnecessary stories and characters. And if Archie was going to be this incompetent with their filings, then Ken would be stupid not to try and take full ownership of his work. Yeah, everyone, himself included, understood that Sega should own the work, but as someone that believes in creators' rights, I think this was a valid move. On top of that, Archie Comics has a long and storied history of screwing over its creators. Most famously, there's Dan DeCarlo, who developed the entire Archie style and created some of the most famous characters like Sabrina the Teenage Witch and Josie and the Pussycats. I mean, hell, Josie is even named after his wife. DeCarlo worked at Archie Comics for decades, but was never given a proper cut of the earnings when his creations were adapted into other mediums, so he sued his employer. But they clapped back with, "Nope, you were work for hire, bucko," and they fired him. Which, I mean, yeah, that's accurate and can't be disputed, but that's not the most egregious issue. What brings my blood to a boil is how DeCarlo was scrubbed from the history of Archie Comics altogether, such as this page that breaks the fourth wall as Betty declares him to be her favorite artist. But when it was re-released, the dialogue was completely rewritten to remove any mention of DeCarlo. Once again, I am not a fan of Ken Penders, but a victory here against Archie Comics is a victory for creators all over the industry who have been taken advantage of and disrespected by the companies they worked for. Regardless, the US Copyright Office sent notices of Ken's filings to both Sega and Archie, allowing them an opportunity to challenge his claim of ownership, but neither company responded, granting Ken victory by default. The best kind of victory. That being said though, if you actually take a look at the certificates that Penders filed, he was only seeking ownership for the text and art that he created. And from what I can see, there's nothing about the characters, which is interesting because that was what Ken was specifically boasting about owning. Even though I'm rocking this very stylish vest and tie combo, I am by no means a copyright lawyer. But several of them have taken a look over these documents, and if the characters weren't involved, then you would think that somebody would have brought that up. And since they didn't, then we can just assume that for all intents and purposes, Ken's filings did in fact give him copyright of these characters. With his ownership of the IP now cemented, Penders sent a cease and desist letter to Archie, claiming that their continued use of his original characters was completely unauthorized. Although editor Mike Paraletto claimed that Ken's claims were, quote, bizarre and unfounded, and that a single phone call from Archie's legal team would have sent him packing, the Penmeister refused to back down, stating that he would use, quote, every legal means at his disposal to protect and preserve his rights, challenging Archie to make a move. Oh, and in the meantime, Penders went ahead and sued Sega and Electronic Arts for ripping off his concept of the Dark Legion in Sonic Chronicles. Archie finally took defensive action by filing a lawsuit of their own against Penders, hoping to settle once and for all who properly owned the various stories and characters, even though they had previously dropped the ball entirely by not responding to the Copyright Office's invitation to challenge Ken's claims in the first place. Now, remember how Ken was told that his original work-for-hire contract didn't exist? Well, Archie managed to dig up a photocopy of one, and it was pretty sus. See, this document was signed in 1996, 2 years after Penders began his tenure on the Sonic comic. Archie's lawyers claimed this was because the original contract was lost or destroyed due to incompetence on their part, and Ken was given this one afterwards so they would at least have something on the record. Now, just to make things clear, this new 1996 contract was just a photocopy, with Archie's lawyers unable to find the original. And for those keeping track at home, this means that Archie somehow managed to lose 2 of Ken's contracts. Penders refused to believe this and took things a step further by asserting that the 1996 document was a straight-up forgery, and he claimed that a comic publisher like Archie would have all the tools and skills necessary to forge a document like this, which, although it's not inaccurate, that is a huge accusation. Considering that Ken had been so confident about his claims and was goading Archie to come at him, you would think that he wouldn't have any issue with duking it out with him in the courtroom. But as soon as the lawsuit was thrown his way, Penders tried his very best to have the entire case dismissed over a lack of jurisdiction since it was filed in New York. After all, Penders doesn't live in New York. He has never done business in New York, and he was living off of unemployment with less than $500 in his bank account, so he couldn't travel to New York for a court hearing. Again, I know I'm rocking the vest and tie combo, but I'm not a financial advisor. But if you don't have a source of income, maybe it's not the best idea to file over 135 copyrights at $45 a pop, hire a lawyer, and try to take on 2 of the biggest video game publishers of all time over one of the most famous mascots in all of gaming history, while simultaneously trying to claim ownership of a major comic book publisher's best-selling series because you think you own the concept of evil Sonic from an alternate dimension that wears sunglasses and a leather jacket. This motion to dismiss was denied, and Penders was flung straight into the fray. So yeah, at this point, Ken is dealing with 2 lawsuits at the same time, so things are going to get a little bit chaotic as we bounce back and forth between them. So let's start off with the Archie case, since that's definitely the most involved of the 2. Ken's team came out swinging with 3 letters from former Sonic comic writers and artists that all backed up his claims that they were never given work-for-hire contracts, with Scott Shaw also stating that he's following Ken's footsteps by registering copyrights for his creations as well, which he got. On top of that, Penders claimed that former Archie editor Justin Gabriel once told him that he had approached Archie's higher-ups with a suggestion that they include work-for-hire language on all of their checks, just to keep things above board, but he was told by those higher-ups that it was completely unnecessary. Archie's legal team insisted on referring to Ken's 1996 contract, and they clapped back at his assertion that it was a forgery, as it was mere speculation and conjecture at best, and at its worst, it's a perversion of our judicial system. When directly questioned about the document's authenticity while under oath, Penders immediately backed down like the spineless bastard that he is. Meanwhile, Ken's lawsuit over at Sega and EA was dismissed, despite all parties involved wanting to continue further. The judge basically told Penders that he needed to finish things up with Archie first because the ruling of that case would have a significant impact on his lawsuit against Sega and EA. But ignoring this completely, Penders refiled the Sega EA case just 4 days later. Now, of course, I will take every single opportunity to continuously dunk on Penders, but refiling this quickly wasn't just because he was impatient. See, the statute of limitations on copyright infringement is only 3 years, which was fast approaching for Sonic Chronicles, so Ken was worried that if he didn't have his day in court as soon as possible, then he would miss out on the opportunity to receive damages. Now, it's worth noting that because this case was dismissed without prejudice, Penders could refile it at any time to collect said damages, but they would only be for the continued sales of the game. He wouldn't get a cent of the initial sales in 2008, which is where the vast majority of the purchases were made, unless he filed before the statute of limitations was up. Even though this concern was plenty valid, the same judge dismissed Ken's refiling by basically telling him,
Order in the court, please. Okay, so before we get started... Ken? Guilty. I literally just told you to get your shit settled with Archie before coming back here. The hell are you breathing in my presence for?
In the midst of all of this, Penders unveiled his most infamous creation, The Aresse Chronicles, a series of graphic novels starring his original characters that would be a reworking of his plot for Sonic Armageddon. Remember, this was announced in the middle of the lawsuit against Archie Comics over these characters, so Ken covered his tracks by making the characters legally distinct. For one, the art style is different, to say the least. Also, these aren't echidnas. No, these are alien echidnias. Oh, and even if it was later decided that Penders did in fact own his original characters, it is impossible to deny that he doesn't and will never own Knuckles. So instead, Ken just renamed him to Knox, but made zero effort to differentiate him from the version that he wrote in a storyline in the future that he had made for the Archie Comics books. Speaking of Archie though, let's get back to that lawsuit. This should have been an open and shut case for Archie, but their incompetence every step of the way wasn't doing them any favors. So they straight up fired their entire legal team and hired a new one mid-trial. Eventually though, Penders and Archie's new team agreed to settle the case, but the two parties couldn't come to terms as to what that would even look like. During these negotiations, Archie Comics did their very best to wipe their hands clean of Ken's characters altogether. First, they had a villain basically yeet every echidna that wasn't Knuckles into an alternate dimension, never to be seen again. This was followed up by the incredible Mega Man Sonic crossover, which ended with a phenomenon called the Super Genesis Wave, which irreparably altered the Sonic comic universe by essentially obliterating all of Ken's over 244 characters out of existence and rewriting the timeline. I'll be honest, this isn't a huge loss since most of the characters were just the so many unnecessary echidnas, and people like Sonic, but a girl, and Sonic, but he's Robin Hood. And see, that's really the crux of it. The reason that Ken and Archie couldn't agree on a settlement was due to the nature of the majority of these characters being derivative works of characters that at the end of the day are clearly owned by Sega. Therefore, it was difficult to come up with a fair agreement of terms without Sega's direct involvement. But here's the crucial thing. If Daddy Sega got involved in the case, then Archie would have to be responsible for covering their legal fees, and they did not want to do that. Not to mention that bringing them in this incredibly stupid lawsuit would really hurt their working relationship. Because of the issue of derivative works, it was looking like this case was going to have to be taken to trial by jury, which would need its own approval. When Archie's new legal team came before the judge and laid out the situation, he said, quote, "So are you saying prior counsel blew it?" To which Archie's lawyer responded without missing a beat, "Absolutely, Your Honor." About a month later, the two parties were able to come to a settlement without taking the case to jury. Archie refused to acknowledge that Ken owns the copyrights to his characters, but agreed that they would not pursue legal action against him if the art specifically doesn't look or feel like it belongs within the Sonic universe. Which certainly explains why the Aresse Chronicles, looks the way it does. With this half-win under his belt, Penders set his sights back on Sega and EA to finally see if he could get that pot of gold that he thought was owed to him from the sales of Sonic Chronicles. But the problem here is that even when he first filed this all the way back in 2010, the sales for the game had pretty much dried up. Or as Sega's lawyer put it in this released audio from the hearing,
he stated in his complaint that he believes that the sales began in July of 2008, but he didn't even file suit against my clients until May 31st, 2011, which is 2.5 years after the first sales allegedly began.
So it's now a thimble of gold.
Well, the pot was gone at that point.
And with that, the case against Sega and EA was at long last dismissed without prejudice. Throughout all these trials and tribulations, all Ken walked away with was an intense desire by all of these companies to never see him again. Archie doesn't republish his work, and the cliffhanger at the end of Sonic Chronicles is going to be forever unresolved, with the game itself being labeled as non-canon, with no plans for future sequels. And because the companies simply don't want to bother, Penders keeps making these self-indulgent victory laps by constantly going on Twitter to brag about his work and his quote-unquote wins in court. He is throwing every single character that he has ever made into the Aresse Chronicles because he knows nobody's going to do anything about it. Though he doesn't realize that he's such small potatoes that it's easier for them to just let Penders be an annoying little pest than give him the time of day. Penders even decided to push the envelope by straight up stealing the character of Shade from Sonic Chronicles by giving her armor and name to Julie Sue, even though he had literally nothing to do with Shade's design or creation in the first place. But I mean, what are Sega and EA gonna do about it? Go back to court over a long-forgotten character from a long-forgotten game just because this man-child can't move on past his glory days? Look, there is zero doubt that Penders was a prolific creator and left a massive impact on the world of Sonic. But as it's done for almost 2 decades since his departure, it can do fine, and even better without him. Despite this, Penders is still chiming away on Twitter, constantly threatening more lawsuits which he never follows through on, while also constantly boasting about how he's more than happy to license his characters out to Sega for any Sonic-related project that they might want to do. And he's also open to license out his characters for original works as well, which he did, and led to its own controversy. And you know what? That is actually a great segue into our final segment, about all the other weird, bad, embarrassing, and gross stuff that Penders has been up to. Before we get into the licensing controversy, let's talk about some of the other weird and problematic stuff that KenPenders is responsible for. I already talked about the weird Nazi shit in part 1, but how about how he's constantly trying to pair 16-year-old Sally Acorn with 25-year-old Joffrey, who is literally just Pepe Le Pew, but a soldier. But don't worry, it's okay, because Sally is actually 32 in squirrel years, and even if she wasn't, the age of consent in Utah is 16. Look, I don't trust anyone who knows what the age of consent laws are in random states off the top of their head. But what about the weird tickle fetish commission art that he did? How about the fact that he requires people to put his copyrights on their fan art and fan fiction? What about the time when Scourge impersonated Sonic and tricked Bunny into laying with him, where it's heavily implied that they had sex? That's just assault. And you know what? Okay, let's talk about Scourge. Originally, he was just an evil version of Sonic from an alternate evil universe named Evil Sonic. Well, in literally the first issue after Penders left Archie Comics, the new Sonic writer Ian Flynn completely redid his character by turning him into the fan favorite Scourge the Hedgehog. In 2001 though, Penders decided to license Scourge to the indie publisher Rush Comics, but as you might have noticed, that name and design are all things that weren't the creation of KenPenders, and presumably he doesn't actually have the rights to hand those out. It's like how Winnie the Pooh is now a public domain character, but if you give him a red shirt, then that's Disney's version of the character and you can get sued for that. Well, funny thing about the Scourge comic, the lead artist for the book was outed as being a white supremacist, and the Sonic community rightfully tore him to shreds. Plus, the writer's previous work was about a speedster character that ripped women's clothes off. So assault. These dudes got so much backlash for that, and also just for being associated with Penders in the first place, that they had to cancel the comic in like a couple of days. They put out this really passive-aggressive apology and said that they refunded all of the donations, but here's the kicker. The Patreon that was funding them only got $29 in pledges. In other Penders trash, Ken announced his plans to get into the NFT game, with each of them priced at $100,000. Yeah, if you want to be the proud owner of this god-awful JPEG and access to bonus material for the weird Space Echidnia book that is probably never ever going to see the light of day, then go nuts. You never deserve to have that kind of money in the first place. We also have Ken getting up in arms about the live-action Sonic movies because there's echidnas in them, screaming to the heavens that those are his characters. Nothing has actually come out of this though, because Ken just loves to threaten lawsuits and then do literally nothing. But he has claimed that he's not scared of going to bat against Paramount. Maybe he's just waiting for the Knuckles TV show to drop so he can rage even more. Oh, and let's not forget that Ken also acts like he's the one that invented the concept of Sonic standing on a plane. Sir, that was from the goddamn video game. You didn't make that. The best thing that KenPenders has ever done was set the stage for his successor, Ian Flynn, to clean up his mess and rework the Sonic comics into something even better. Even when Archie Comics lost the rights to the Sonic license in 2017, Flynn went over to IDW to write the reboot. And you know what? It's really fucking good. And that's even with the fuck ton of mandates and restrictions from Sega, who are trying to prevent another Pendering from ever happening ever again. The IDW Sonic comics are, in my opinion, some of the best Sonic-related anything out there. And the love and passion that Ian Flynn has for his work and his fans is incredible. Meanwhile, Penders is constantly shit-talking about Flynn on Twitter because he's so desperate to live in the past. KenPenders is a sad, sad man. He hasn't worked on Sonic in almost 20 years, and yet he's devoted his life to it. He's a deeply bitter narcissist who's constantly yelling about his detractors on Twitter and hyping himself up as this creative savant, despite having not delivered anything for his beloved Lara Sue Chronicles. Look, I get it. Twitter brings out the worst in people. The website actively encourages outrage, misinformation, and hate, with everybody trying their hardest to be witty assholes. I hate the person that Twitter encourages me to be, which is why I've left the platform entirely and hope to God that I am not masochistic enough to ever return to it. But Ken, I know you're watching this. You are deeply invested in your self-image, and you never miss an opportunity to engage in the digital self-harm that is watching negative videos about yourself. I have said a lot of mean things about you in this video, but I'm begging you, it's time to let Sonic go. making yourself into this clown honking anytime an echidna shows up is not doing you any favors. Yes, I think your current art is absolutely disgusting to look at, but you have shown that you're capable of making decent stuff. The Lara Sue Chronicles is not going to be a hit. It's not even going to be mildly successful, and I know that you know that. The best thing that you can do is just move on, man. Get off of Twitter, take a breather, disengage from Sonic discourse, and use that creative brain to make something original. But guys, that's it. That's all I have. I want to give a big thank you to the ThanksKenPenders and TheAmazingSallyHogan Tumblr accounts, because they were great resources for researching this topic and putting me on the right track of where to start hunting down the legal documents that I used to put this all together. And hey, if you want to learn more about the IDW Sonic comics for yourself, then I made a video when they first came out that really captured my initial excitement. Who knows, if this video does well, then maybe I'll dive into those books for a future video. But anyway guys, I hope you learned at least a little something new, and hopefully, I'll see you next time.